Elise Kaufmann counted the women ahead of her in line the way she counted everything, quietly, without moving her lips. 6. She was 7th. The processing building was a converted supply depot. 2 fans moved the air without cooling it. A corporal sat behind the intake desk with a clipboard and a pen, and the flat efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. She saw his left hand first. The scar ran from the base of his thumb to his wrist, pale and slightly raised, the kind of scar that comes from asphalt and speed and a bicycle that stopped faster than the rider did. She had watched it happen on Vine Street in the summer of 1933. She had been 11. He had been 12 and trying to impress someone, and had gone down hard on the corner of Vine and Elder, and she had been the one who ran to get his mother. She knew the scar before she knew the face. Then she looked at the face. James Aldridge. From 6 blocks away, from the church on Liberty Street where the sermons were half English and half German, and the hymns were always German because that was how the over-the-Rhine neighborhood did things, had always done things, would probably keep doing things long after the war rearranged everything else. James Aldridge, who had carried her mother's groceries up 3 flights of stairs every Saturday without being asked, who knew 24 words of Cincinnati German that existed nowhere else on earth, who had waved to her from a porch on a June morning in 1936 when her father's truck pulled away from 412 Vine Street and she had pressed her face to the rear window and watched the street get smaller until it disappeared. She had 3 seconds. She used them to decide. The 5th woman stepped away from the desk. The 6th stepped up. Elise looked at the floor and built the wall, not out of coldness, but out of the particular discipline of a woman who has spent 9 years learning that the wrong reaction at the wrong moment costs more than silence ever does. By the time the 6th woman stepped away, the wall was up. Kaufmann. His voice. 10 years older, flattened by the military into something clipped and functional, but underneath it the same. The slight pause before the first syllable of a name, as if he was checking himself. She had forgotten that. She had not known she remembered it until she heard it. She stepped forward. She looked at his face and not at his eyes, the way you look at a bright light sideways. Kaufmann, Elise. Born Cincinnati, Ohio, 1921. He read it in English. Something about the word Cincinnati made her throat tighten. She had not heard the word spoken aloud by anyone in a very long time. Yes, she said, in English, not German. The word came out before she could stop it, shaped by 10 years of muscle memory from a street where you said yes and not ja, and everyone understood both, but only one of them was home. James looked up. It lasted less than a second. His eyes found her face and moved across it the way you move across a page when you're reading quickly, looking for something specific, not sure where it is. She kept her face still. She was good at still. She had learned still the hard way. Nothing crossed his face that she could name, or nothing that stayed long enough to name. He looked back at the clipboard. He checked the box. Next. She walked through the gate into the women's compound. She did not look back. She listened for her name behind her. Not Kaufmann, not prisoner, but the name a boy had called across a fence on Vine Street when he wanted her to come outside. She did not hear it. She found her assigned bunk and sat on the edge of it and put her hands flat on her knees and kept them there until they stopped shaking. He had not recognized her, or he had not let himself. She understood the difference. She had spent the last 4 years in the company of people who had learned that not letting yourself see a thing was easier than seeing it and having to decide what to do. It was a skill. She had it herself. But she had seen his hand shake when he checked the box, just slightly. Just enough. She looked at the ceiling of the barracks and thought about Vine Street in July, the particular smell of it, the sound of German and English trading places in the same sentence, the way the light came through the window of her mother's kitchen in the morning. She thought about the truck pulling away and James getting smaller and smaller on the porch until he was just a shape and then just a street and then nothing. 9 years. And here was the corner of Vine and Elder again, except this time neither of them was moving, and the distance between them was not 6 blocks but something harder to measure. She folded her hands in her lap and said nothing to no one. She was good at that too. If these stories are resonating with you, please leave a like and subscribe to help us bring more of this history to light. Also, I'd love to know which part of the US you're watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. Elise did not test him on the first day. She thought about it. The idea passed through her mind while she stood in the laundry line and again while she waited for soup at the mess table. There were things she could say, things only someone from Vine Street would understand. A phrase from the butcher on Elder, a joke her mother used at church socials, a way of pronouncing Rhineland that only the neighborhood said correctly. She said none of them, not because she was afraid he wouldn't understand. Because she was afraid he would. James moved through the camp with the same careful economy he had as a boy. Not hurried, not loud. He had the posture of someone who had learned not to waste movement in a room where every movement might matter. She noticed that first, then the pen in his right hand, always clipped to the same angle. Then the way he did not let his attention rest too long on any one face. He was practicing not knowing. That was what she decided by the second day. On the third day, during medical intake, she sat across from a nurse while James stood beside the desk and checked forms. The nurse asked the usual questions. Any pain, any fever, any trouble sleeping? Elise answered yes, no, in a voice that sounded flat to her own ears. James did not look at her. When the nurse asked where she had lived before Germany, Elise said, Cincinnati. The nurse wrote it down. James's hand stopped moving. Not much. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but Elise saw it. The pen paused above the paper, then continued. He still did not look up. The nurse asked if she had family in the United States. No, it was not exactly true. It was not exactly false either. Her mother was dead. Her father had become a man she no longer counted. The city remained. The people did not. After intake, she was sent back to the compound and put to work folding bandages in the infirmary. The work was dull and repetitive and useful in a way that made it easier to bear. She folded one strip, then another, then another. She heard footsteps outside the door and knew without seeing that James had come down the corridor. He stopped outside. He did not enter. She did not turn. The wall she had built at the processing desk stayed in place, but now there was a seam in it. Not a crack, a seam, something narrow and dangerous. At supper she saw him from across the yard. He was standing near the supply shed, speaking to Lieutenant Marsh, who was holding a clipboard and listening with the expression of a woman who expects details and gets them. James handed her a paper. She glanced down, nodded once, and moved on. He looked tired in a way she remembered from street corners and summer evenings, not from the army. His face had changed enough to make him older, and not enough to make him new. That night she heard one of the women in the bunk beside hers say, "You knew him before?" Elise kept her eyes on the blanket. "No." The woman gave a sleepy hum and turned over. Elise stayed awake a long time. She thought about the scar on his left hand. The bicycle, the way he had carried her mother's groceries without complaint. The way he had stood on the porch in 1936 when the truck pulled away and not said anything because there was nothing a boy could say to that. The next morning she made a decision. It was small. That was why it was dangerous. When the line formed for work detail, James stood at the end with a stack of clipboards. Names were called, boxes were checked. No one looked at anyone longer than necessary. When Elise stepped forward, she waited until he had read the line above hers. Then she said, in a voice just low enough to sound accidental, "You still drop your pencil when you get nervous." He did not move. His hand did not move either. He checked the box. He said, "Move along." It was exactly the right response if he had not heard her. It was exactly the wrong response if he had. Elise walked past him without turning her head. She made it all the way to the tool shed before she felt the answer land. He had heard her, not because he looked at her, because he had gone very still in the second after she spoke, the way a person does when a sound from the past reaches them before the mind can catch up. That night she watched him from the barracks window as he crossed the yard under the dim light near the fence. He stopped once and looked toward the women's compound, though not directly at her window. He stood there for a long time. Then he resumed walking. Elise folded her arms and sat back from the glass. She had not given him a name. She had given him a question, and now she knew he was carrying it. James did not speak to her for 4 days. Elise could feel the shape of that silence changing around them. It was not avoidance now. It was something active. He knew. She knew he knew. And still, they moved through the camp as if the distance between them were ordinary. On the 5th day, an officer asked for her file at the medical station. James was there when they pulled it. The lieutenant was a man with thin lips and a habit of speaking as if every sentence had already been approved by someone above him. He asked where Elise had been born. He asked when she had last been in the United States. He asked whether she had relatives in Ohio. Elise answered only what she had to. James stood beside the desk and said nothing. The lieutenant leafed through the papers. Cincinnati birth record, he said. Returned to Germany as a child. Civilian nurse. No political affiliation on record. Interesting background. He said interesting the way some men say suspicious without using the word. James looked at the top page. Then, before the lieutenant could close the file, he saw the address. 412 Vine Street. It was typed in black ink, small and clean. James's mouth tightened. Not much. Enough. Elise saw it happen. He knew. Not vaguely. Not as a shape. He knew the street. He knew the house. He knew exactly how close it had been to his own. 6 blocks. 8, if you took the longer way around the church. It did not matter. Everyone from that neighborhood knew the map without needing to think. The lieutenant was still talking. If her record checks out, she stays in the infirmary. If not, we move her to the labor detail. James said, her record checks out. The lieutenant looked up. You reviewed it? Yes, sir. It was flat. Safe. Correct. The lieutenant nodded and closed the file. Then that settled. He left. The room stayed the same after he was gone. The table, the lamp, the smell of paper and disinfectant. But the air had shifted. James kept his eyes on the folder. Elise said nothing. He picked it up again, slowly, and looked at the address one more time. Bartodoshe Vine Street. Then he put it down with more care than before. He turned and walked out of the medical station without looking at her. Elise remained still for a long time. Not because she was afraid of what he would do. Because she had just seen the thing she had been waiting for. Recognition. Not the warm kind. Not the dramatic kind. The hard kind. The kind that settles into a man and stays there because it has nowhere else to go. That evening she folded bandages with hands that no longer shook. The next morning James passed the infirmary door carrying a stack of forms. He did not enter. He slowed for half a second, just enough for Elise to know the pause was intentional. Then he kept walking. That was his answer, not a word. Not yet. But it was no longer nothing. At lunch she found Lieutenant Marsh in the corridor outside the kitchen. She had a practical face and a way of looking at people that suggested she had already measured them against whatever problem they were carrying. Elise stepped aside to let her pass, but the lieutenant stopped. You know the corporal? She asked. Elise looked at her carefully. No, ma'am. The lieutenant held her gaze a beat too long for coincidence. Then she nodded once. Good. That was all. She walked away. Elise stood where she was and let the words settle. Good. Not I know you know him. Not I know something is happening. Just good. The sort of answer that tells you someone has noticed more than they are saying and has chosen not to make a problem out of it. That night James was not at the fence line when she looked. He was at the infirmary door. She saw him through the open frame while she carried folded towels to the shelf. He was holding a medical form in one hand, waiting for a signature. A real reason. A legitimate one. He knocked once. Come in, Elise said. The room was empty except for them. James closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment with the paper in his hand. He did not speak. Elise looked at the form. What is it? Transfer note, he said. For the bedding inventory. I need your initials. He handed it to her. She took it and saw that the form was already signed by 2 others. The last line waited for hers. She initialed the paper. Neither of them moved. Then, very quietly, Elise said, You knew. James did not answer at once. He looked at the floor, then at the shelf of folded towels, then back at her face. Yes, she had expected that answer. It was still harder than the silence. When did you know? She asked. At the desk, not all of it. He swallowed once. Enough. Why didn't you say anything? His eyes flicked toward the door and back. Because I didn't want to hear it out loud. Elise nodded slightly. That made sense. Too much sense. Did you think I would say something? No. Why not? James's face changed just a little. The answer had cost him something. Because if you had wanted to, you would have. Elise looked at him then, really looked. He was older, yes. Tired, yes. But the boy she knew was still somewhere inside the man in front of her. Not preserved. Altered. Buried under uniform and discipline and years of not looking back. But there. She said, I remembered your hand. He looked at his left hand as if he had forgotten it was there. The scar, she said. He gave the smallest nod. You fell off your bicycle on Vine Street and cried because you thought your mother would make you stop riding. He almost smiled. Almost. You told on me, he said. I did not. You told my mother I'd broken the brake cable. I saved you from lying to her badly. That was the first thing either of them had said that belonged entirely to the old neighborhood. James let out a breath he had not meant to show. Elise saw him working not to say more than he should. She was doing the same thing. Do you remember the church basement? She asked. He glanced up. The orange soda? And your cousin getting sick on the hymn books. He closed his eyes briefly. My mother never let us live that down. For the first time since she had seen him at the desk, Elise felt the wall move. Not fall, move. It was enough. James stepped back toward the door. I should go. Elise nodded. Then, before he opened it, she asked, Do you still know the route to Elder Street from the alley behind the bakery? He looked at her for a long second. Yes, he said, and then he left. Elise stood alone in the infirmary and listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She had not expected warmth. She had expected the harder thing, and now she had it. James came back the next afternoon. He had the same paper in his hand, but Elise knew before he spoke that the form was only the excuse. He stood in the doorway with the heat behind him and the smell of dust on his uniform, and looked at her as if deciding how much of this was allowed to exist. You have a minute? He asked. Elise nodded. He closed the door. This time he did not wait by it. He came in far enough to stand beside the table, not across from her, not too close either. That bothered her more than if he had moved directly into her space. It meant he understood distance. It meant he was measuring it on purpose. I read the address again, he said. Elise said nothing. 412 Vine Street. Yes. He looked at the paper in his hand, though he was not reading it. I stood outside that house half a dozen times and never thought I'd see it written on a military form in Tennessee. It was still the same number. He let that sit. Your father sold the hardware store before you left. Elise looked up at him sharply. He gave a brief nod. My mother talked, everybody talked. She said your father thought Germany was going to fix everything. It was never going to fix anything. No, James said. It wasn't. The certainty in his voice mattered. More than she wanted it to. She folded the towel she had been holding and set it on the table. Did you think I would have said something at the desk if I had recognized you first? James answered carefully. No. Why not? Because you always knew when to keep your mouth shut. That was unfair, and true. She almost smiled at the same time she wanted to correct him. You remember me that well? She asked. I remember the whole block, he said. The bakery smell, the church bell, your mother calling you in at dusk like the day had to be negotiated with. Elise looked away. Memory had a way of making the room larger and smaller at the same time. What happened after 1936? He asked. She knew what he meant. After the truck, after the house, after Vine Street stopped belonging to them. My father became serious, then louder, then certain. She kept her voice even. He wanted Germany. My mother wanted the house to stop shaking every time he opened a newspaper. James listened without interruption. We left in the spring. He said it was temporary. He said we were only going to see family. She gave a very small shrug. The lies were always more polite before they became permanent. James leaned one shoulder against the wall. I wrote twice. I know. He looked at her. You do? My mother told me, after the letters stopped. She said she knew you kept writing. He said almost too quietly, I did. Elise nodded. I wrote too. He stared at her. I wrote for a long time after they stopped coming back. James's face changed in a way she had not seen yet. Not surprise, not exactly sorrow. Something closer to the pain of a door opening after years of being kept shut. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Elise answered honestly. Because I did not know if I was allowed to still be the girl on Vine Street. He looked down at the floor. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher. You were. It was such a simple sentence that it nearly undid her. She turned to the shelf and pretended to straighten a stack of folded cloths she had already arranged twice. James waited. Then he said, My mother kept your last letter. Elise turned back. It was the one about the church picnic, and the flood on Elder Street, and your mother's apricot cake. He gave a tiny, strange smile. She kept it in the top drawer with the tax papers. Elise laughed once before she could stop herself. It came out more like a breath than a sound. James looked relieved by that, which made her want to laugh again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elise said, Your mother hated your handwriting. He blinked. She told you that. She told everyone. He shook his head with a look of private surrender. That sounds like her. The door rattled once from a gust of air outside. Neither of them moved toward it. What happens when you go back? Elise asked. James looked at the paper in his hand again and then set it on the table. I don't know. You could stay. The words surprised even her. She had not meant them as an invitation. They came out as a fact from a place beneath thought. James looked at her, but he did not answer right away. I mean, she said, and then stopped because she had said too much. He did not make it harder. Stay where? In the neighborhood. He almost smiled. You think there's still a neighborhood? Elise thought of Vine Street, of how everything had changed, and yet some corners likely still smelled the same in the summer. There is always a neighborhood somewhere. James let out a short breath through his nose. That's a very Cincinnati thing to say. It is. He looked at her for a long time after that. Long enough that she understood they were standing at the edge of something neither of them knew how to enter without damaging it. At last he picked up the form, folded it once, and put it in his pocket. I should go, he said. Elise nodded. He paused at the door and looked back. You still remember the route to Elder Street? She met his eyes. Yes. Then you'll know the shortest way to your mother's church if you ever need it. Elise did not answer. She didn't trust the answer to be simple enough. James opened the door and stepped back into the heat. She stood in the infirmary and listened to his footsteps disappear. Then she sat down very carefully in the chair he had stood beside and kept her hands in her lap for a long time. Elise noticed the shift before anyone said anything about it. It was small at first. The way James was assigned to the infirmary door more often than the yard gate. The way Lieutenant Marsh started bringing forms herself instead of sending a runner. The way nobody asked questions about the times James and Elise were in the same room with a legitimate reason for being there. That was how the camp worked. Not with permission, with tolerance. On the morning the papers arrived, James was already at the desk. Elise had been sent to the medical station to sign a transfer sheet for bandage inventory. Lieutenant Marsh stood beside him, one hand on the file, the other resting on the back of a chair. She looked from Elise to James and then back again. Your file is in order, she said to Elise. Birth record, civilian work history, no security concerns on paper. A beat. You will remain in the infirmary unless that changes. Elise nodded. Lieutenant Marsh slid the folder toward James. And you will sign the recommendation that she stays on light duty until repatriation review. He read it once. Then again. Elise watched his face. It was the kind of paper that mattered because it did not look like much. One signature, one recommendation, one sentence on a form. But in a camp like this, that sentence was a door. James signed it. Lieutenant Marsh took the form, checked the bottom line, and nodded once. Good, she said. It was the same word she had used before. Elise looked at her then and understood, with a clarity that felt almost unfair, that the lieutenant had known all along. Not the details, but enough. She had seen two people from the same street trying not to be what they were, and she had decided not to interfere. After she left, James folded the pen cap back on and set it down very carefully. "You didn't ask?" Elise said. He looked at her. "Ask what?" "Whether it mattered." "It matters," he said. The answer was immediate, almost impatient, like he was offended by the possibility that it wouldn't. Elise looked down at the form. Her name, his signature, the camp stamps in black ink. "It doesn't change what I am here," she said. "No," he said, "but it changes how they treat you while you're here." That was more than enough. She knew it and disliked that she knew it. He slid the form into the folder. They reviewed the medical logs. "You're due to be moved to the West Transport list in 2 weeks. Elise kept her face still. And then someone decides where Germany thinks you belong. Germany, not home. Not yet. She heard what he did not say. He was not promising anything. He was stating the shape of the road ahead and leaving the rest where it was. After the transfer sheet was filed, there was no reason for him to stay, but he did. He leaned against the desk, looking at the window instead of at her. "I got a letter from my mother." Elise waited. He drew it from his pocket and held it without unfolding it. "She says the neighborhood still argues about everything, the streetcar, the church repairs, whether the bakery should stay open on Sundays." Elise let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Of course they do." He looked at her. "She says Mrs. Danner still keeps 2 kinds of sugar in separate jars. She always did. She says your mother's cake recipe still gets asked for at church suppers." Elise turned her face slightly so he wouldn't see it. "It was a mistake." The feeling was too old for the room. "My mother would have liked that," she said. James did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Mine still says she expects you to come home and complain about the weather like everyone else." Elise smiled before she could stop herself. "I never complained about the weather. You complained about everything else. That is not true." He looked at her for a long moment. "It is." She should have denied it. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Then James said, quieter, "Do you remember the butcher shop on Elder?" "Yes." "The man with the missing finger. The one who always gave us candy if we brought back his crate lids." "That's the one." James folded the letter again and put it away. "I walked past that place last time I was home. The sign was different, but the smell wasn't." Elise said, "It never is." He nodded once. There was a knock on the door. A corporal entered with a stack of records and set them on the desk without looking at either of them long enough to make it odd. James straightened and took the top folder. Elise recognized the motion. The room had returned to itself. Official. Efficient. Safe. But not entirely. Because when the corporal left, James did not leave with him. He stayed until the quiet settled again. Then he said, "I have to tell you something." Elise looked up. He was not looking at her yet. He seemed to be choosing the floorboards as if they had the answer written on them. "When I saw your name at the desk, I knew the street before I knew your face." He paused. "Not all of it, not at first, but enough." Elise did not move. "I spent the first day trying not to think about the last time I saw your mother packing the truck." His voice was low, and the part I keep coming back to is that I didn't say anything. I stood there and watched you go, and I didn't say anything because I didn't know what the right words were. "There weren't any," Elise said. "I know that now." She looked at him carefully. "That is not what you mean." He glanced up then, and there it was. The thing beneath the carefulness. The old boy from Vine Street, not all the way gone, not all the way hidden. "No," he said. "It isn't." Elise waited. "I mean that I should have tried anyway." The sentence sat between them with a kind of plainness that made it hard to argue with. He was not asking forgiveness. He was not making himself noble. He was simply telling the truth as it had become visible to him. Elise considered that. "I should have too," she said. He looked at her as if the answer had surprised him. "At the desk," she said. "I should have said your name." James gave a short, almost helpless exhale. "You would have had to be sure. I was sure." He looked away. The fact of that mattered too much. They both knew it. The afternoon deepened outside the window. The camp noise stayed where it was. Somewhere down the corridor, a bucket clanged against a wall. Someone called out for a doctor. Life continued with the indifference of things that do not know they are standing beside history. James reached into his pocket and took out a folded sheet of paper. "I wrote down the streetcar route," he said. Elise stared at him. "From Vine Street to Liberty. In case you ever forget it." She laughed once, softly, and then stopped because the feeling underneath it was not funny at all. He handed it to her. She took it and unfolded it. On one side, he had written the route as if he were explaining it to someone who had been gone too long. On the bottom, in a smaller line, he had written the name of the bakery where her mother used to buy rolls on Sunday morning. Elise read it twice. "James," she said, and for the first time in years she used his first name without it sounding like an old memory. He looked up. "Do you think," she asked, "that anyone ever really leaves a street like that?" He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "No." The word was simple, the kind of answer that leaves very little room for comfort and a great deal for truth. Elise folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. James picked up the folder from the desk. "I should go before someone decides to wonder where I am." She nodded. At the door he paused, his hand on the latch. "When you leave," he said, "write." It wasn't an order. It wasn't even quite a request. Elise met his eyes. "I will." He nodded once and went out. She stood alone in the infirmary for a long time after the door closed. Then she took the route sheet from her pocket and looked at it again, not because she needed directions, but because she needed proof that something from home still knew how to find its way into her hands.